Do you know what nemesis means? A righteous infliction of retribution manifested by an appropriate agent. Personified in this case by me.
If you read the Bible, Mark, you'd know that there won't be another 1,000 years. Right now we're in the last days as foretold in the book of Revelation.
The last days? You mean the coming of the apocalypse, right? The rapture.
You only have to look at the signs. There are wars and rumors of wars.
Now, just so the rest of us know how much time is left, when is the rapture supposed to hit? Exactly. Is it midnight New Year's Eve?
That's right.
Now, is that midnight LA time or Eastern Standard Time or what? I mean, what time zone has got in anyway?
I pray for you all.
Yes, my beloved true seekers, it's the end of the world, but the reality is that the end of the world already happened. It happened at the point of creation when the eternal realm became corrupted by a mistake that entered the divine consciousness, a small inconsistency like a misfired synapse. And we are living this mistake, all these billions of years, all these veil of tears, a mere flash in the wholeness that is the pleroma. We are ripples unevenly traveling away from the source, the all, depth and silence as the Valentinians called it, trying to figure out how to change the flow of the waters of existence.
What if this is as good as it gets?
And that's why it's no mistake you have emanated yourself here at the virtual Alexandria, listening to yet one more saga called Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. That's why you are understanding that you are a god in the becoming while you stand side by side with me, Abraxas, and his mortal reincarnation on this approximately September 22nd, 2007. We've been waiting for you all of your life. So since the end of the world already happened, realize eschatology as they call it, and the Heilig and Fundagelicals foolishly await the apocalypse that will only leave them blue-balled, we must understand what went wrong so that we can correct it. Philip K. Dick said that the fall of mankind wasn't an emotional fall, but more of an intellectual fall. We became trapped when our minds accepted that the illusion that is the universe was real.
Gonads are useful for their purpose, but they are no substitute for brains.
The great Dick also said that since the universe is basically waves of information, and it seems modern physics support this, that thus only information would lead us out and back into the treasury of light, as the Manicheans called our home of homes. And this information, pure and transcendental, is known as gnosis, although the Greeks called it anamnesis, or remembering. All learning is remembering, Plato once wrote. Remember who you really are before you are cast into the body of a dying animal. Remember where you are, which is in a wonderful mirage of ongoing disappointments, a place you must understand you'll never belong in, even though you may love it very much. Remember the steps backwards so that you can truly travel forward in spiritual evolution. Remember.
This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
But also remember that there are agents that won't just let you pop and lock back to heaven. These are nefarious, deficient beings that were created when the true Father lost his wisdom, had his little mind fart that was projected into the emptiness and then caused the cosmos, a mere reflection of the perfect realms above. Candyman. The Gnostics call them archons. The modern man calls them the ego. Fundagelicals call them legion. And New Agers don't call them anything because they're too stupid to understand that there is real suffering and evil outside of their IKEA-decorated living rooms, crystal and Chinese Buddha-infected walls, while they sip on organic California Chardonnay and listen to the latest Yanni CD.
There are far worse things awaiting man than death.
And how did the archons get us? Well, they help us forget our royal heritage in order that we may become docile inside our fleshy husk. They lied and seduced and raped us until we believed that pain was normal and redemption was on the other side of life. You probably know a few at your job or in past relationships. Look at my good friend Jehovah. Like Nietzsche said, his first commandment wasn't anything he gave Moses on Mount Sinai. No, his first commandment was to Adam and Eve, and that was, "Thou shalt not know. Thou shalt not know."
If you do not know the present, how can you claim to know the future?
But the cosmic Christ, disguised as a wise serpent, helped them in knowing, helped them through their punishment with the aid of our mother Sophia, and eventually helped all of mankind, at least those of the seed of Seth, as the ancient Gnostic call themselves. Like the Gospel of Thomas says, Jesus said, "If they say to you, 'Where have you come from?' say to them, 'We have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself, established itself, and appeared in their image.' If they say to you, 'Is it you?' say, 'We are its children, and we are the chosen of the living Father.' If they ask you, 'What is the evidence of your Father in you?' say to them, 'It is a movement and a rest.'" Yes, part of remembering is accepting that we need help, or else we would have fixed our lives by now, individually and collectively.
What makes it so hard is not that you had it bad, but that you're that pissed that so many others had it good.
Utopian Greek means nowhere, and that's where good intentions always land us, or worse. We need a supernal mediator who will grant us gnosis, so that we may nurture our own gnosis. In the West, he is known as Jesus, but he has also gone by such names as Zoroaster, Mani, Seth, Asclepius, the Nous, Osiris, Dionysus, Buddha, and even Lucifer. And yes, there are plenty of female saviors, but I already mentioned a few in our past show on Mary M. So we need all the help we can get to find our origins.
The third principle of sentient life is its capacity for self-sacrifice. For a cause, a loved one, or for a friend.
And today we gain a great deal of help from our guests by understanding how Gnosticism began. Understanding the beginning and you'll understand the end, as Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. So we are joined by Berger Pearson, author of Ancient Gnosticism, Traditions and Literature, Gnosticism, Judaism, and Egyptian Christianity, and one of the original translators of the original and the new Nag Hammadi library. I really enjoyed Ancient Gnosticism because it's a formidable refresher course for those who are veterans of Gnosticism, as well as an excellent guide for newbies. It's the kind of book you would read as a freshman when studying comparative religion in college. Another bonus is that Berger gives us the entire cliff notes of the Nag Hammadi library. You don't have to read the Gnostic scriptures if you don't want to, because in his book you get a good feel for each of the Nag Hammadi tractates.
Scholars maintain that the translation was lost hundreds of years ago.
Saves a lot of time for those of you who don't have the patience or money, but need that nurturing of your spirit. Berger also reinforces what I've said from the first show, and that is not only is Gnosticism earlier than Christianity, but it's more than likely the first Christianity. And mind you, that many other scholars like John Turner, another translator of the Nag Hammadi library, Timothy Freak, Robert Price, John Lash, Stephen Davis, just to name a few, have gotten my back on this. The mediator, or the advocate, as some know him or her, simply morphed into Jesus around the 1st century. That is all.
I'm not the Messiah!
Why so many scholars insist on keeping Gnosticism in a purely Christian box is a mystery to me. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those cats who wants to stamp on the Gnostic label to anything esoteric or controversial. That's already being abused by so many false prophets these days wanting to make a quick buck or an extra lay. But I do believe we need to face the truths even if we don't like them. Playing it safe in ivory tower so you can enjoy tenure and maybe a bestseller here or there is just playing right into the hands of the demiurge or the cosmic collective ego.
Shop smart. Shop S-smart.
Many of these scholars have made incredible breakthroughs we should definitely be very grateful for, but they still won't leave the safe confines of Gnosticism being an offshoot of Christianity, and that includes several people I respect very much. Worse still, there is a scholastic movement to redefine or even erase the term Gnosticism. That is just silly. If we're going to go down that path, then we might as well begin eradicating the term Christianity. We'll separate Methodists and Catholics and Mormons into their own religions. It's the same comparison when you really think about it. Sure, there will always be debates on the Gnostic pedigree of Marcion, the Manicheans, the Cathars, but let's not get all medieval on everything that came out of the Nag Hammadi library.
Careful, Chief. You dig up the past, all you get is dirty.
With the help of greater minds than my own, I've defined Gnosticism several times on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. Just go to the excerpt section of my homepage and listen to such clips as the 4 Mythemes of Gnosticism, the 12-step program of Gnosticism, how to spot a Gnostic in a crowded room, and you'll more than likely understand that there's such a worldview as Gnosticism. As for what my pea-brain thinks of the origins of Gnosticism, I've already addressed it before. Gnosticism is a Jewish mystery school. It happened more than likely in the 1st or 2nd BC era, with mystical Jews tired of the temple politics and the brutal Hasmonean dynasty. They fled to the diaspora and absorbed classic Greek culture. They discovered through apocryphal texts that such OT stalwarts as Seth or Enoch were indeed bringers of salvific knowledge. They created their cults of Joshua, who was the archetype of the savior of Israel despite his King Leonidas attitude. They discovered the teachings of Plato, who in those times was so honored by all cultures he was referred to as the divine Plato.
I'm waiting to be impressed.
Now you may ask, what does Greek philosophy have to do with mystery religions? That's simple. Most of the Greek philosophers were initiated in Egyptian mystery religions, including Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle. It was Aristotle that said that one does not learn in the mystery, but one undergoes the mysteries. And that is just like Gnosis. You experience it, but you can't actually translate it in mundane words, only with myth, art, and poetry. And that's what both the philosophers and Jewish Gnostics did. They conjured myriad new myths, rewrote older tales, and understood both of them as psycho-spiritual tools of liberation.
We can never see past the choices we don't understand.
One great example is a particular account of Dionysus. In this Orphic myth, as a child, he is accosted by titans who wish to devour him. Zeus, in this role as the unknown father or the no-god of the Gnostic sage Basilides, throws his usual thunderbolt at the titans. He destroys them, but also the youthful Dionysus. Dionysus represents the godly essence. The titans are the earthly archons. Thus the divine sparks of Dionysus are mixed with the material substance of the titans, and thus the gods attempt to fish out the divine sparks, are plight in order that Dionysus, the primal man like Jesus, is restored to Mount Olympus, which means a pleroma. So backing up a bit, we more than likely had Jews who were tired of their tribal god Jehovah, who allowed the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, their own rulers, and the Romans to kick them around with Bruce Lee accuracy. They knew their reality just sucked, that the kingdom of God wasn't coming, and thus decided to take a voyage inward to find treasures beyond imagination. And that's the same with us modern Gnostics. We continue to suffer under eras of wars, soulless politicians, and Borg-like corporations. We're let down by the infected egos of our friends, family, and loves. We're pushed around by the bad fortune of a flawed universe in our shoddily crafted mental states. God is preached in churches and mosques around the world, but that only cultivates more hatred than love, more false hopes than enjoyment of the present. The Orthodox Jesus is never coming a second time, although the Gnostic Jesus never left. We're frustrated, almost hopeless, until we begin excavating into our subconscious to find the pearl of great price.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The world isn't going to change, my beloved truth seekers. It was crafted that way by Zebra or the Artifact, Philip K. Dick's version of the Demiurge. Only you can change, and it can't be an external change. It has to be through the universe that is our imagination, the seat of our divine spark.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.
So don't forget that we write our own gospels and create our own myths here at the Virtual Alexandria. We are legend. Let us return to the beginning of the end. And Berger Pearson will take us a step further by understanding the truth of the origins of Gnosticism. This is a Coffee and Cigarettes and Gnosis interview. With us today is Berger Pearson, author of Ancient Gnosticism, Traditions and Literature. How are you doing today, Berger?
I'm very good.
Good. Thank you very much for joining the show and taking your time today.
No problem.
Okay, why don't we start with the root of everything. What would you say are the origins of Gnosticism?
Well, why don't we back up and ask what it is? Because that's a very debated position right now.
Yes, that was one of my subsequent questions, but go ahead. We'll start right there and work our way down.
Okay, because there are scholars, friends of mine, in fact, who have written sort of nonsensical things about wanting to get rid of the term Gnosticism altogether.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask you. What did you think about this new movement?
Well, I don't approve of it, but in any case, that I think Gnosticism existed and still exists is one of the things I try to show in 362 pages of my book. Okay, so now what are the origins? Well, that's a debated point because, part of the debate about the definition is that, particularly as baldly as Karen King puts it, historians of religion such as myself have set up this category of Gnosticism in order to create a barrier around Orthodox Christianity. Her point is that Gnosticism, or what people call Gnosticism, never existed. That, in fact, it's one of the varieties of early Christianity, which has just as a legitimate a claim to belief or practice as any other version of Christianity, ancient or modern. So my point is that Gnosticism did not originate as a Christian heresy. Her point is actually what was argued by the ancient church fathers, that the earliest Gnostics known to them were all Christian heretics. This was the standard view until the 19th century, when historians of religion who were interested in the comparative study of Near Eastern and Middle Eastern and Indian and other traditions began to look at the bigger picture and could see that what was described at that time, mainly by early Christian fathers as Gnosticism, looked an awful lot like some of the stuff they were uncovering in ancient Babylonia or ancient Iran or ancient India. As a result of this kind of comparative historical scholarship, it began to be asserted that one could see aspects of Gnostic versions of Christianity that did not appear to be part of original Christianity at all, but had been imported by Christians. And furthermore, that the Gnostic Redeemer, who is essentially the figure who brings heavenly knowledge or gnosis to human beings, could appear in all kinds of avatars. The Christians picked the figure of Jesus Christ as their avatar of Gnostic redemption. But in fact, even the most ancient sources that were then available to the 19th century scholars working in the history of religions could see that aspects of what they called Gnosticism certainly did not have Christian origins. The real breakthrough in the study of ancient Gnosticism came with the discovery of manuscripts written in Coptic and preserved in the sands of Egypt. That's where you get the primary evidence that scholars could now use in their comparative philological historical research to shed credibly new light on that whole question of the origins and, in fact, even the definition of what Gnosticism might be.
In your book, don't you basically say that Gnosticism began, if anything, as a Jewish heresy?
Yes, that's my view, but not only mine, but the view of many other people. This could only become clear although this was argued in the 19th century already by a Jewish scholar named Moritz Friedlander, who looked upon the Gnostic materials that he could see in the writings of the Church Fathers as essentially Jewish, heretical Judaism. But that was a view that did not capture a good deal of attention, and only came back to the fore with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi and other Coptic Gnostic texts, where it becomes abundantly clear that the essential building blocks of Gnostic mythology are reinterpretations of Jewish scriptures, Jewish scripture interpretation, and Jewish traditions.
But isn't Plato extremely important to this growth? Why is that?
The Jewish people in question, who were instrumental in this, essentially what becomes a new religion, were thoroughly imbued with Platonism. From the 1st century BC, metaphysically important Platonism became widespread and influenced a good deal of other cultures, and notably Jewish culture, particularly in the Greek-speaking Jewish diaspora. I say from the 1st century because Platonism, after Plato himself, took on a sort of a skeptical stance in the philosophical school that he founded, the Academy. And it was only with Eudorus of Alexandria and others from the 1st century that a renewed interest in metaphysics and religion appeared in what it by scholars now is called Middle Platonism.
And what characteristics did the Gnostics borrow from Plato?
Basically, with Platonism, you have a metaphysical dualism between the material world and the non-material, the intellectual or the spiritual dimension of, and for Platonists, that's the real reality. The so-called ideas, as this is Plato's term, those spiritual entities of which the material components of the universe are only copies. That is one of the main features of Platonism that Gnosticism took over. However, what the Gnostics did with that basic Platonic dualism was to reinterpret Plato to say that the world as we know it, the material world, is not at all the best of all possible worlds, but in fact is the product of a lower, malicious, or ignorant deity, and that the real deity is beyond this created order and beyond the Creator and the angels that worked with him in creation. Now, here you have in the Gnostic reinterpretation of Plato also the introduction of certain, especially Jewish elements. For example, Philo of Alexandria, 1st century Jewish philosopher, talks about the angels of God assisting in the creation of human beings, that is their bodily part. And this is something, of course, that comes out of Plato. In Plato's Timaeus, it's the lower gods that are assigned that task of helping the demiurge to create human bodies. These lower gods become, in Jewish reinterpretation, angels. But in the Gnostic reinterpretation of that Jewish reinterpretation, these angels are not good angels, they're bad angels.
And they also took other characteristics too. I think you mentioned reincarnation, the body being the tomb of the soul, and other...
Yes. Not all Gnostics believed in reincarnation. Some did. And this is a feature that they would have gotten from popular Platonism and Pythagoreanism. So it's not completely clear that it certainly isn't the case that all Gnostics believe in reincarnation. Some did, some didn't. What also is important is, and this is something that goes beyond ancient Platonism. According to the ancient Platonic and philosophical beliefs, also Aristotle and others, the world is essentially eternal. There is no end of the world. There is no destruction. Now, in Stoic philosophy, there's the notion of a fiery end to the world as we know it, but then everything starts all over again. So even in Stoicism, you have this ongoing cyclical history of the world. But what the Gnostics did was simply take over an early Jewish eschatology that the world would come to an end.
And don't you mention too that the word itself, Gnosticism, was used by Plato? What was his context of Gnosticism?
The term Gnosticism was invented in the 17th century. However, it is based on the adjective gnostikos in Greek, and that is an adjective that was used by Plato. Plato referred to a gnostikos type of knowledge or of science as over against other types of knowledge or science. It's only amongst the Gnostics that the term gnostikos comes to be applied to human beings, to people. That is a notion you will not find in any of the Platonist writings.
And did any of the Gnostic sects actually call themselves Gnostics?
Yes. Well, most notable are the ones that are referred to by St. Irenaeus as the Gnostike Hieresis, or the Gnostic school of thought, and he refers to them as people who refer to themselves as Gnostikoi, people with knowledge. Now, it has been asserted by some scholars, and in this they are actually correct, that the term Gnostikos or Gnosticism, this term itself does not occur in any of the Nag Hammadi or other Coptic writings.
How did the concept of gnosis come about? Does it have a precedent to the Gnostics?
Gnosis, it means knowledge. In the case of Gnosticism, gnosis is the very basis for salvation. One comes to gnosis by having it revealed to that person, and through that revelation is awakened from ignorance and from sleep or from drunkenness. These are various metaphors that are used for the state of a human being before he or she received gnosis. And once the gnosis is revealed to that person and accepted by that person, that's the basis for ultimate reintegration to the world of the divine from which that person had originated. One of the essential features of gnosis, as in terms of its content, is that the knowledge that saves, is the knowledge that the world in which we live is not the real world, or it's not the eternal world, but is a fallen world, and our souls, or our innermost beings, are actually divine and consubstantial with a divine being who is beyond the world and ultimately is not responsible for its creation.
And what I thought was very interesting about your book is that you point out that one of the roots of the term gnosis comes from Old Testament apocalyptic literature like Enoch. In other words, it's the divine revealing itself to humanity.
There are obviously Jewish apocalyptic influences upon Gnosticism, but in the case of Yada, for example, of verb for to know in Hebrew, used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or da'at, as the term is in Hebrew. This is also a revealed knowledge, but the revelation, the content of the revelation, is what causes apocalyptic Judaism, such as you find in First Enoch, to differ from the Gnostic version. In apocalyptic versions of Gnosis or Da'at, what is revealed is what is going to happen in the end time, and what will happen in terms of, and what's the nature of the cosmos, and how things are going to come out for the good or for the evil, depending on what the status of a given person might be.
Going back to the history or first century history, Could you tell us a little about the father of Gnosticism, Simon Magus? Do you consider him really the first Gnostic we know about?
Well, he's the first one we know about. There might have been others. There may have very well have been others. The most important thing to know about Simon Magus is that the New Testament account of his doings is skewed. That is, it is completely unreliable. What can be gleaned from the book of Acts chapter 8 is that there was a Samaritan who was performing wonders probably in the city of Sebasti, but anyway, in an urban center in Samaria. His name was Simon, and he was referred to by detractors as a magus or a magician. Even the New Testament book of Acts says he refers to himself as the power which is called great, or the great power. In other words, he claimed to be a manifestation of God. The great power actually is a term that comes out of Samaritan theology.
Have you ever heard any, what do you think about the theories that Simon Magus is just a code word for the Apostle Paul?
Maybe I should have covered that in my book, but in any case, where that comes from is a Jewish Christian writing from the 2nd century that became part of what are called the the recognitions and the homilies of Clement of Rome. Pseudo-Clement we call him, because the real Clement lived in the 1st century. This basic document that stands behind the recognitions and homilies of Clement was written by a person or people who hated the Apostle Paul. So Paul and Peter in that writing sort of are on opposite ends of the pole, and Simon Magus is the actual opponent of Peter in those writings. But behind his presentation, that is the view of Simon that you get in that writing. It can be seen that there is an anti-Pauline twist to this, that the real opponent of that document was Pauline Christianity and the Apostle Paul.
And while we're on the topic of Paul, why do you think the Gnostics and also the Marcionites were so gaga over his writings?
Not all of them were, but...
or the Valentinians, at least.
Well, particularly the Valentinians, yeah. For them, he is the apostle. Marcion is a special case because although Marcion's theology was certainly influenced by Gnosticism, that is, his notion of a God beyond God and so forth, he cannot really be called a Gnostic because he was a Paulinist Christian who asserted that faith and justification by faith in the Pauline sense is what is essential. For him, the natural human being is a human being that needs to be redeemed, not on the basis of any component that he has within himself, a spark of life or whatever, but this is an act of salvation that's done completely by grace, by God, and is not based on any kind of knowledge or anything of that sort. So in that sense, Marcion cannot be included in the history of Gnosticism, only as a kind of an appendix. Maybe I should have made an appendix in my book or a special chapter on Marcion, but in any case, Marcion was not a Gnostic in the sense that I've defined it in my book.
Right, you do mention it, but why do you think Valentinus and the Valentinians really were taken by Paul?
Well, they gained a great deal of insight into looking at Paul's writings. I mean, Paul was one of the most prolific of the early Christian writers, and what he says, particularly in terms of the doctrine of resurrection and this sort of thing, could be subjected to a Valentinian reinterpretation, such that Paul would be the authority behind their view of what salvation is really about. Of course, this isn't real Paulinism, but they had their view of how to interpret Paul, and this becomes clear in many of their writings. The treatise on resurrection, for example, is dependent upon a particular reading of Pauline epistles. And there's a good deal of Pauline influence in the Gospel of Truth as well. Mm-hmm. But you asked me why they were so taken with Paul. I guess I should say I don't know.
And leave it at that. Somehow he got to them. What I noticed too, and I was reading your chapters on Saturnalius, the first Christian Gnostic, and reading some on Basilides, but isn't it true that Gnostics did not believe, many Gnostics did not believe that salvation or gnosis was for everyone? Some people got it and some didn't, or in fact some people didn't even have the divine spark within them.
That's right. That's particularly the case with Valentinianism, at least as it was interpreted by the ancient Christian fathers, and some scholars still hold to that view that the Valentinians believed that certain people had no ability to achieve gnosis on the basis of their makeup. Now, it could be argued that what looks like this kind of predestination on the part of Valentinian theologians was nothing more than the kind of predestination doctrine you find in the Bible. That could be argued, I guess. The ultimate proof as to whether a person will be saved or not is at the end when he or she dies. Does he have gnosis or not? So that's the ultimate proof. If a person achieves gnosis, then it can be seen that that person is a spiritual one who was capable of achieving gnosis.
Berger, do you see any texts in the Nag Hammadi library that point to some people having no souls and some people having souls?
There's a passage in the Apocryphon of John, that's sort of a catechism that describes various kinds of people, and you can interpret that catechism to imply that there are people whose nature it is ultimately to fall into perdition. But in any case, that view would just be a wrinkle on ancient Jewish and Christian beliefs, that some people are saved and others not.
You also call Sethian Gnosticism classic Gnosticism in your book. Why is that, Berger?
Well, actually, that's a term I borrowed from Bentley Layton in his book, The Gnostic Scriptures, and I refer to his translations in several chapters in my book. He refers to that group of people and group of beliefs referred to by Irenaeus as the Gnostic school. He refers to this as classic Gnosticism. A lot of times this is referred to now by scholars as Sethian Gnosticism only because Nag Hammadi texts, especially the Apocryphon of John, have many parallels to the kind of mythological system described by Irenaeus in those chapters in Book 1, chapters 29 to 31. Irenaeus never refers to Sethians at all, and the only reason that scholars refer to this as Sethianism is to come to some way of designating Gnostics who refer to themselves as the seed of Seth or the generation of Seth or the children of Seth and so forth in the spiritual sense, because it's clear that the biblical Seth, son of Adam, plays an enormously huge role in that group of texts that now scholars refer to as Sethian. So those Sethian texts are the texts that Bentley Layton are related to those smaller number of texts that Bentley Layton would refer to as classic Gnosticism.
And isn't Seth basically, instead of Jesus, the mediator figure, the bringer of gnosis for this sect?
Yeah, and in Christian versions of Sethian Gnosticism, Seth appears in history as one who puts on Jesus, that is, who is incarnated in some sense, in the figure of Jesus. So that in Christian Sethianism, Seth appears ultimately as Jesus.
Do you see this as an evolution from Seth to Jesus, or do you actually see if they were originally about Seth and they were later Christianized in the 2nd, 3rd century?
Yeah, I think this is a Christianization of an earlier notion of Seth as a revealer. For example, in the Apocalypse of Adam, the Apocalypse of Adam features Seth as the recipient of revelation he gets from his father Adam. But Seth is the one who transmits this revelation, and he, of course, plays a leading role in that document.
Why was it so important for the Gnostics to reinterpret the Genesis account? What were they looking for?
I guess you would say, I would be inclined to, I don't know why, but I would be inclined to say that they looked upon their traditional scriptures with a new eye because they didn't like the traditional interpretation. So what they did was look at creation accounts, particularly the first few chapters of Genesis, with a new lens, and in fact they came up with what turns out to be building blocks of the whole mythological system. This is laid out in chapter 4 of my book.
Right. You also talk about mythopoeia. For the listeners, what is that?
Mythopoeia is a tendency to produce myth. Myth making. Poeia comes from a Greek word meaning to make. So this is myth making. Now, why did the Gnostics make myths? And what is the nature of Gnostic myth? Well, scholars in the history of religions refer to myths used by traditional cultures, myths of various sorts, creation myths and other kinds of myths, that stem from hoary antiquity to pre-literate times, and that are handed down through generations and generations. That's not the kind of myth that is involved in Gnostic mythology. Gnostics might have chosen to create myths because Plato did. When Plato wanted to give expression to certain ideas, he would create a mythos. For example, his creation myth in Timaeus, or the myth of the cave that you find in the Republic. And there are a number of these kinds of myths that want to make a certain point. That may very well be at least one of the feeders into the creation of Gnostic mythology.
So it's safe to say that neither Plato nor the Gnostics ever meant for it to be taken literally.
Probably. Yeah, I think that's the case.
So moving down towards the 2nd century, we have, it seems, the most influential school, the Valentinians. Do you see the Valentinians maybe or Valentinus himself, trying to accommodate both the Catholic Church and the God of the Old Testament? He was like the Henry Kissinger of the time.
Valentinus, according to Irenaeus, adapted the Gnostic school of thought in his creation of a new theology, a Christian theology. So in the case of Valentinus, we have a Christian teacher who produces a version of Christianity that is very much based upon or an adaptation of a previously existing Gnostic system. That's the reason you can find a number of interesting correspondences between the Apocryphon of John, say, and the myth in that text, and the classical Valentinian myth that was attributed by Irenaeus to Valentinus' disciple Ptolemy. A number of interesting parallels in their various myths. But for Valentinus, the most important thing was to see Jesus as the Savior and as the one who provides gnosis and salvation for his people. Not only that, but Valentinus took over early Christian writings such as the Gospels and the Epistles of Paul and subjected them to his new theological interpretation. and intended, actually, to be a part of the Christian community of originally in Alexandria. What he intended to do was to have a variety of Christianity with the traditional sacraments, baptism, Eucharist, and so forth, as just another variety of Christianity that you could find in that great city of Alexandria. It was not until toward the end of the 2nd century that Gnostic versions of Christianity in Alexandria would be deemed heretical or unacceptable.
Yeah, and he seems even in the Gnostic, in the Valentinian cosmology and cosmology, doesn't even the demiurge become redeemed towards the end?
Well, at least he assumes a level of salvation that is lower than, but a level of redemption. That's true, and he is not conceived as that malevolent being that you find in the Apostle John, for example. So the demiurge is although he is a lower creator, and he can even be referred to as a foolish god in terms of what happens when he begins to create. Nevertheless, there is a certain hope for him in the end that is not given to other varieties of the Gnostic demiurge.
In your book, you also talk a lot about the Manicheans. Why did you decide to do a chapter on the Manicheans? Since it seems that's another point of controversy, whether Mani was a Gnostic or not.
Well, he's always, by historians of religion, always been included in histories of Gnosticism, so I included it. You can see very clearly that Mani was heavily influenced by Jewish and Christian versions of Gnosticism, although what he did, of course, was create a completely new mythology, very complicated one, in fact, but it can certainly be seen as modeled upon Gnostic predecessors.
And did Mani believe in gnosis, salvific knowledge?
Oh, sure. Yeah, okay. Well, that's an important part of his whole idea.
And moving on a little bit more throughout history, can you tell us a little bit about the last surviving Gnostics, the Mandeans, and maybe a little about their mythology?
The Mandeans are a very interesting case because some of their writings came to be known in the very late 18th century, early 19th century, and one of their major books, the Ginza, was translated into Latin from Mandaic, which is a kind of Aramaic, in the early 19th century by a guy named Petermann. And then another very, very great German scholar, Marcus Lidzbarski, did some translations into German of Mandean writings. These writings became the basis of a good deal of discussion amongst historians of religion interested in Gnosticism, because it could clearly be seen from these writings that there were elements that are very much akin to what you could find in descriptions of Gnostic writings and beliefs as laid down by the Church Fathers. Of course, that was before the discovery of the Coptic stuff. But once the Coptic stuff was discovered, then the correspondences became even more clear. And the greatest scholar who has worked on that is still alive today, and my former colleague at UC Santa Barbara for a while, Kurt Rudolph, an East German scholar originally, has worked extensively with Mandean texts, and in fact, Mandeans themselves spent some time in doing research in Iran and Iraq. He is the one who has pointed to these very close correspondences between the so-called Sethian Gnostic traditions and the Mandean mythical traditions. And thus, he would be one of a number of scholars who trace the origins of the Mandean religion back to first century Palestine.
And in their mythology, why do you think that they make Jesus into the bad guy and John the Baptist into the the real hero?
Well, that is a particularly interesting question. But what it does, I don't know why they did that. But what it shows, though, is that Mandeism is a variety of Gnosticism that never had anything to do with Christianity. This gives the lie to this whole idea that the original Gnosticism was a Christian and variety of Christianity. That's just complete nonsense.
And it's possible they might have actually been a sect of the John the Baptizer.
Yeah, well, there is some discussion amongst scholars of early Christianity that the followers of John the Baptist continued to exist and became rivals of early Christians, followers of Jesus. And this kind of rivalry might have been involved somehow or other in how the proto-Manicheans, we might call them, viewed the figure of Jesus. I mean, he'd be the bad guy and John would be the good guy. But what's funny is that Jesus' mother becomes a good girl.
Mm-hmm.
That's the funny thing.
Yeah, and isn't it also odd that the Holy Spirit is bad? And some other, they turn a lot of things upside down.
Yeah, well, but that's typical of Gnostic reinterpretation.
Yeah, see where it goes. And lastly, Berger, how did you get involved in the Nag Hammadi Library Project?
Well, I say a little bit about that in the preface to my book. I was a student in a Lutheran seminary in Berkeley back in 59, 60. I graduated in 62 and came across one of the earliest publications of a Gnostic writing from Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Thomas. I got interested in this, and I could read some Greek words that appeared in the text of the Gospel of Thomas, but the rest of it was completely foreign. And I decided then and there I was going to study Coptic. And so when I went to Harvard, I began my study of the Coptic language. So as I was finishing up at Harvard, I left and went to Duke University, and back in when was it? The early 1968, I guess it was, that James Robinson came to Durham, North Carolina, to visit people at Duke, including myself, who had been recommended to Jim by my teacher, Helmut Custer, at Harvard. So he got me involved in the project. He got a professor at Duke, Orville Wintermute, involved, and one of his graduate students, John Turner, who has become a leading scholar of Sethian Gnosticism in the meantime. Anyway, the three of us became involved in that project. I got a grant from the Research Council at Duke to spend a couple of weeks of 1968 out at Claremont, and worked with a bunch of other people who were in the project in a seminar room in the Honnold Library. We were looking at photographs, black and white photographs of the manuscripts that Jim Robinson had gotten in Paris. Jim had already given me 36 of these photographs before I went out to Claremont, and assigned to me the Codex 10 to work on, which is the most fragmentary of all of the codices.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So obviously it took a very long time before I could ever publish anything on that. So from 1968 until 1981, it took that long for me to publish Hammadi Codex 10. The publication also includes Nag Hammadi Codex 9, so it's a book that has both codices. 3 writings from Codex 9 and 1 from Codex 10.
Yeah, and you got quite a bit of the Sethian works, didn't you?
Well, I got involved with that variety of Gnosticism by looking at some of the other texts. Of course, I was studying the other ones as well. For a time, I was assigned to work with a scholar, a young scholar working on Zostrianos, but then moved over and took over Codex 9 instead. But anyway, this was at the time, during that summer of 1968, I also got a phone call from University of California, Santa Barbara. Would I like to be interviewed position there because Jonathan Smith had left and they wanted to replace him. So paid for a Greyhound bus ride from Claremont to Santa Barbara, and I went and was interviewed for the position that I began in 1969. Mm-hmm. During the summer of 1969, I spent the whole summer in Claremont, going home to Santa Barbara only on weekends. And then eventually, when the actual manuscripts began to be rephotographed for the facsimile edition, it was a project of UNESCO. Some of us from the Claremont team were also included in those work sessions in Cairo. So I was able to work on the actual papyri themselves in the Coptic Museum in Cairo.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the new translation put out by Marvin Meyer? Have you had a chance to look at it?
I was involved in it.
Ah, well.
I've got three of the translations in that book, but also I was working with other scholars. We had meetings at the University of Laval in Quebec where we'd go through the whole thing. So I was involved in the editing project of the whole translation, the whole volume.
Oh, well, I didn't know that. I actually just got my copy finally a few days ago. I haven't been able to open it. I was enjoying your book so much, I couldn't.
Well, thank you. The only text that I didn't have access to at the time we were working on that translation were the ones from the Codex Chacos, Gospel of Judas included. But I was in the very last minute able to include the Gospel of Judas in my book. Short notice on the Gospel of Judas, which I would gladly rewrite now because I missed some points.
For the listeners, isn't it true, because you hear a lot from a lot of polemics, people not wanting people to read the Gospel of Judas, but the Canaanites never existed. Canaanites, sorry. I'm talking about the people.
Named for Seth's brother Cain, who killed his
right. But the Canaanites were basically Sethians. The Gospel of Judas is a Sethian work.
Well, the Gospel of Judas is the mythology found in the Gospel of Judas is typically Sethian Gnostic.
And do you think maybe it was Christianized, or do you think it's...
Well, in the actual mythological stuff in the Gospel of Judas, there's not much Christian to it, actually. So even Marvin Meyer has come up with the idea that this is a lightly Christianized version of Jewish Gnosticism. The figure of Judas himself, and obviously this is the Gospel of Judas is a Christian product, generally speaking. Because of, Judas Iscariot and Jesus and the rest of them play a role in it.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Berger. I'd like to thank you for coming on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis.
Okay.
And I would definitely recommend the readers to get Ancient Gnosticism. It's a very good work, short work that gives you the A to Z on Gnosticism.
Actually, the advertisers advertise it at 200 and some odd pages. It's 362. And they came up with the original price, $25, I think, based on the idea it was only going to be 200 and some odd pages. But so $25 is a bargain, but you can get it at Amazon.com for $16.50.
Wow! So yeah, definitely it's a steal at that price. That's for sure. Because like I tell the listeners, or we talked about, you get the whole Cliff Notes on the Nag Hammadi library. Okay, well, thank you very much for appearing on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, and we will talk to you at a future point.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.